The city is quiet at 11 p.m. until the Mafia boss's private line rings. A waitress is shaking so badly she can barely speak. An unconscious girl, blue lips, faint pulse, and a name engraved inside a silver bracelet. The boss doesn't ask, "Who did it?" He asks, "Where?" Because he already knows this is a trap. At exactly 11 p.m., the city always sounded the same from the top floor of the Calderon Hotel. Sirens softened by distance, tires whispering over wet asphalt, bass thumping from clubs that stayed open by permission rather than law. Marco Calderon had built his empire by learning to read those sounds the way other men read scripture. The rhythm told him which streets were hungry, which corners were calm, which nights carried the metallic taste of trouble. Tonight, the rhythm broke. The private line on his desk rang with a tone reserved for one kind of emergency, the kind nobody should survive long enough to report. Marco watched the handset for a single breath, measuring the timing, measuring the intent, measuring whether the ring itself was a threat. He lifted it and kept his voice flat, a habit carved into him by years of men trying to bait him into feeling. The voice that reached him was a young woman's, strained into control by panic. She was not calling for money. She was calling because she had stepped into something that did not belong to ordinary people. She identified herself as a waitress from Santoro's on Harbor Avenue. Marco's mind tightened around the location. Santoro's was neutral ground where judges, donors, and polished criminals ate under warm lighting and pretended the city was civilized. It was a place Marco protected precisely because it made important people comfortable. It was a place where the rules were supposed to be unbreakable. The waitress explained, in rushed fragments, that she had found a young woman unconscious behind the service alley. She had checked the pulse. The breathing was shallow. The skin was cold. The lips had a bluish tint that spoke of oxygen being stolen. The girl wore a silver bracelet with an engraved name inside. The waitress had looked, not out of curiosity but out of desperation, and the name inside the bracelet was Elena Calderon. Marco's body stayed still while his blood turned to ice. His daughter did not appear in alleys. His daughter did not get lost. His daughter traveled with security, the way a storm traveled with thunder. If Elena was unconscious behind a restaurant, then either his protection had failed or someone had peeled it away with a blade. He did not allow the waitress to call an ambulance. Not yet. Not because he wanted to delay help, but because he needed control of the scene before control became evidence and evidence became leverage. He directed the waitress to stay hidden with the girl, to keep her warm, to keep her out of sight, to keep the phone open, and to prevent anyone from touching her. He ended the call without softening the edges, because softness invited mistakes and mistakes killed people. Within a minute, Rafe Salerno entered the office. Rafe was the kind of man who made hallways feel narrower. He had a broad back, gray at the temples, and eyes that never stopped evaluating exits. Marco gave him the facts with the simplicity of a gunshot. An 11 p.m. call, Santoro's alley, Elena unconscious, unknown cause. Rafe's first question was the one that mattered. Elena had a detail. Where was it? The answer came with a fracture. The detail had checked in less than 20 minutes earlier. Elena had been inside a private room, meeting someone connected to an internship at the district attorney's office, a compromise arrangement designed to keep her future clean while her last name remained dirty. She was expected to leave after 11:15. If she had ended up outside early, then either she had slipped her guards or her guards had been distracted, drugged, paid, or replaced. Marco and Rafe moved like men following an alarm inside their own chest. They took the private elevator to the underground garage where black SUVs waited with engines already warm. No sirens. No official lights. Only velocity and discipline. Marco slid into the back of the lead vehicle and stared through tinted glass as the city smeared into reflections of neon and rain. Every intersection felt like a question posed by someone with a knife. Rafe pulled an exterior feed from a nearby camera that faced the service alley. The footage was grainy, wet with static and drizzle, but it told a story clearly enough. A dark sedan rolled in at 10:52 p.m., not marked as delivery, not behaving like a patron. Two men stepped out. They moved with purpose, not panic. Between them, they carried a limp body and placed it behind stacked crates near the dumpster. One of the men crouched near the wrist, angling the bracelet so it would catch light. The other stood half-turned, scanning the street with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the night belonged to him. Then both men walked away as if they had finished taking out trash. Marco's jaw tightened until it felt like bone grinding. The bracelet adjustment was not care, it was a signature. Whoever did this wanted Marco to identify the girl quickly, wanted the message delivered before the body could be found by police or by strangers. The SUVs turned off Harbor Avenue into the service road behind Santoro's. The restaurant's front glowed warm and wealthy, umbrellas clustered like flowers around valet stands. Behind it, the alley smelled like grease, damp cardboard, and the city's hidden labor. Under a broken light, the waitress waited, small and rigid, apron still tied, phone clutched as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Marco stepped out and saw what the waitress had been guarding. Elena lay on her side behind crates, hair damp against her cheek, skin drained of color. The silver bracelet was there. The engraved name inside was not a rumor. Elena's breathing was visible but thin, the chest rising like it was forced to climb a hill each time. There were faint marks at the edge of her jawline, not bruises yet, more like pressure points touched too hard. Rafe checked for obvious wounds without moving her more than necessary. Marco's hands hovered near Elena's face, but did not touch. Touching made it real, and real made him dangerous in ways he could not afford. The waitress had done one thing right. She had kept Elena hidden. She had done another thing braver. She had made the call at all, knowing exactly what the name Calderon meant. Marco's men formed a perimeter. The alley, for a moment, belonged to the Calderons again. But ownership did not solve oxygen deprivation. Marco made the only decision that mattered then. He ordered Elena lifted carefully into the SUV and turned the city's underworld into an emergency corridor. A private medical facility would be safer than any public hospital. A doctor with no political ties would be summoned. A security sweep would be done on every guard assigned to Elena. As the SUV door closed, Marco's gaze returned to the waitress. Her face showed the kind of fear that lived beneath duty. She had seen his daughter. She had called. Now she was part of the story whether she wanted to be or not. Marco did not thank her. Gratitude was a luxury. Instead, he memorized her name, her posture, her eyes, and the way her hands shook as if they wanted to run but refused. People like her did not stay innocent in Marco's world. They either became collateral or they became proof. The convoy pulled away, and the broken light above the alley flickered once, as if the night itself were blinking. Behind them, the security feed continued to record rain falling on the place where Elena had been left like a warning. The private clinic sat behind a silent gate and a row of manicured trees that looked expensive enough to be trusted. Marco had paid for it in installments of favors rather than money, the kind of debt that never appeared on paper. It was the sort of place where people with important names healed quietly, and where mistakes were buried as deeply as bodies. Elena was carried inside through a rear entrance, away from reception desks and any staff who might whisper. Rafe's men sealed the hallways, checked vents, locked stairwells, and shut off external camera access. If this was an attempt to draw Marco into an ambush, the clinic would not be a simple stage. A doctor arrived within minutes, called from sleep and escorted through security like a prisoner of necessity. He was competent, older, and careful with his eyes. He asked questions in the language of medicine, and received answers in the language of power. He did not demand explanations. He demanded time. Elena was placed under monitors. Oxygen was delivered. A line was inserted. Blood was drawn. Marco watched from a corner where he could see her face and still remain unseen by anyone else in the room. He knew the outlines of every enemy he had ever made, but tonight the enemy had reached through those outlines and placed a hand on his daughter's throat. The doctor's first conclusion was not dramatic but deadly. Elena was not simply intoxicated. The pattern suggested a depressant paired with something that interfered with respiration. A combination designed to create unconsciousness and silence, not quick death, at least not immediately. The dosage was precise enough to feel intentional. The doctor ordered a toxicology screen and administered a reversal agent with caution, as if the drug in her blood might bite back. While medicine worked, Marco worked faster. Rafe pulled the roster for Elena's security detail. 4 men. A driver. A lead. All vetted, all paid well, all chosen because they had families and debts that anchored them to loyalty. Rafe called each number. 2 phones rang unanswered. 1 went directly to voicemail. 1 was turned off. The driver answered on the second attempt, voice thick with confusion. He claimed he had been told Elena was staying longer and had been dismissed for the night. He claimed he had never seen her leave. His story was too smooth, too rehearsed, like a coat pressed flat to hide stains. Rafe had the driver located within 10 minutes. He was not at home. He was not at a bar. He was not at any place where a man off duty could be casually found. His phone was now dead. Marco's silence became a kind of gravity that pulled men into motion. Orders spread outward. Lock down every exit the detail could use, sweep every safe house, pull traffic cameras around Centaurus, and find the dark sedan from the alley footage. That sedan was not a vehicle. It was a signature on a contract. In a separate room, Marco had Lena, the waitress, brought in by Rafe's men. Not in cuffs, not harmed, but not free. She looked as if she had been transported out of her own life and deposited into an expensive nightmare. Her hands were red from scrubbing at her apron, a reflex from someone who cleaned when she could not control. Rafe collected her statement without drama. Lena had stepped outside after a late table asked for something not on the menu. She had gone to the alley to retrieve extra supplies. She had heard a sound, not a scream, more like a small exhale from someone losing strength. She had found Elena behind the crates, half hidden, and recognized her face from photographs that circulated in the city like warnings. Lena had checked the bracelet only because the name mattered. She had heard stories that Marco Calderon did not tolerate lies, and she needed the truth to keep herself alive. She had also noticed something else. A smell. In the alley, near Elena's hair, Lena had smelled a faint chemical sweetness, like a cleaning solvent mixed with perfume. It had reminded her of an incident months ago when a customer spilled something clear and sweet on the bar and complained of dizziness minutes later. That memory had stayed with her because it had frightened her how quickly a body could betray itself. Rafe logged the detail. The doctor listened, interested, because chemical sweetness sometimes meant certain sedatives dissolved in flavored liquid. It suggested Elena might have been drugged via drink, perhaps even in Santoro's private room. Marco's eyes narrowed on the implication. If Elena had been drugged inside Santoro's, then the restaurant's neutrality was compromised. Either the staff had been infiltrated, or someone with influence had arranged the room, the service, the glass, the timing. Neutral ground had been weaponized. Elena stirred once under the reversal agent, not awake, but shifting, as if her body were trying to surface from deep water. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted. Her throat worked. The monitor beeped faster for a moment, then stabilized. Marco moved closer without realizing it. The man who ruled streets and boardrooms with calm violence found himself holding still like a child afraid to break something fragile. He watched Elena's lashes tremble, and wondered how many nights he had spent thinking his power was protection. The toxicology results came back in segments rather than certainty. The doctor identified as SATA, type consistent with a prescription drug, but the metabolite ratios were strange. It looked cut, altered, or combined with another compound. There were traces of something that should not have been in a glass at a restaurant. The doctor said the drug was common among those who wanted someone compliant and forgetful. Forgetting was its own kind of murder. Marco felt a pressure behind his eyes that was not grief, but rage compressing into focus. Whoever did this did not want Elena dead quickly. They wanted her alive long enough to serve a purpose. A hostage. A bargaining chip. A threat delivered with the implication of worse to come. Rafe's phone buzzed again with new information. The dark sedan from the alley footage had been spotted earlier on traffic cameras circling Santoro's neighborhood, making loops as if waiting for the right moment. The license plate had been altered with tape. The model was common. The driver's face was never clear. But the vehicle's movement pattern revealed something important. It had stopped for 12 minutes near a storage facility by the waterfront before arriving at Santoro's. That meant Elena had likely been moved twice, once from the restaurant, once to the alley. 2 stages. 2 locations. Someone had used the storage facility as a transition point, either to administer the drug, to strip her of evidence, or to ensure she was unconscious enough to be left without waking. Marco ordered the storage facility secured. He ordered the owner brought in if necessary. He ordered every camera feed around the waterfront pulled and analyzed. In the clinic, Elena's fingers twitched. Her hand moved slightly against the sheet, a subtle sign of returning control. The doctor cautioned that waking could bring confusion, panic, or respiratory distress. Marco waited anyway, because waiting was the only thing he could do that did not involve breaking the world apart. When Elena finally opened her eyes, she did not speak. She did not form words. Her gaze moved slowly, unfocused, and then locked on Marco with a kind of recognition that felt like a knife turning. Her mouth opened again. No sound. Just breath. Her eyes filled with something that was not fear of him, but fear because of him. Because the last thing she might remember was his name being used as a weapon in a room full of strangers. Marco leaned closer, careful, controlling his own breathing as if it mattered. He watched her pupils adjust and saw the moment her awareness sharpened enough to communicate. Elena's hand moved weakly toward the edge of the sheet. Her fingers traced a small shape against the fabric, not random. A pattern. Rafe watched, understanding the implications faster than most men could. Elena was trying to write, trying to show something without speech. Her fingers formed 3 letters, slow and trembling, a name, or the start of one. Marco's heart did not race. It froze. Because the letters she traced were the beginning of a surname Marco knew too well, a surname that belonged not to a rival gang but to someone who sat in rooms with officials and claimed to hate criminals while using them. A man whose power was supposed to be outside Marco's reach. A man whose name meant the city's law could be turned into a blade. By dawn, the city was still wet, still gray, still pretending that night had simply ended. Marco Calderon had not slept. He had not eaten. His mind moved through possibilities, like a blade testing fabric. Elena drifted in and out of medicated awareness. She could not sustain speech. Her throat seemed raw, her breathing still recovering. The doctor explained that sedatives combined with forced positioning could cause irritation, that someone might have pressed her jaw, covered her mouth, or held her in a way that left faint marks without visible bruising. The doctor also warned that some drugs could erase memory in patchwork segments, leaving only sensations and flashes. Marco did not need a full memory to begin killing the right people. He needed only enough to confirm direction. Rafe assembled a team at the clinic, men who were loyal not because they feared Marco, but because they understood the consequences of betrayal in a world where betrayal was currency. Marco directed the investigation in layers. One layer hunted the missing security detail. One layer scrutinized Santoro's staff and private room logs. One layer isolated the waterfront storage facility as a potential staging ground. Another layer traced the political name Elena had attempted to write. It was a dangerous move. Marco's empire had rules about touching politics. Politics brought federal attention. Politics brought long wars fought with paperwork and headlines. But someone had already crossed that line by using Elena, and Marco refused to be the only one bound by restraint. Lena, the waitress, was moved to a protected apartment under guard. Not as a prisoner, but as a witness who could be erased if left unprotected. Marco understood that people like Lena were the easiest kind to silence. No armed convoy. No security detail. Just a quiet disappearance. Tonight's attackers had chosen a waitress precisely because she was invisible enough to be convenient, and brave enough to be believable. Rafe's men visited Santoro's before the breakfast crowd arrived. They did not threaten the restaurant publicly. They did not cause a scene. They simply closed doors, entered offices, and turned the illusion of neutrality into a controlled interrogation. Staff lists were pulled. Shift schedules examined. Private room reservations reviewed. Inventory logs checked for unusual alcohol bottles, new mixers, unaccounted cleaning solvents, or delivery receipts that did not match shipments. The private room Elena had used the previous night was stripped with forensic care. Marco did not trust the police, but he employed men who had learned to hunt in silence. They found faint residue on a glass rim, a sweet chemical trace consistent with Lena's description. They found a single fingerprint that did not match the staff list. They found a smear near the doorframe at shoulder height that suggested someone had waited there, leaned there, or struggled there. More alarming was what they did not find: the camera footage. Santoro's internal cameras were intact, but the hours surrounding Elena's meeting contained a blank segment. Not a typical glitch. A precise deletion. Someone with access had removed that window. That meant the attack was not just physical. It was administrative. Someone had planned to erase time. At the waterfront storage facility, Rafe's men found evidence of a short stop, fresh tire tracks, a lock that had been opened and closed recently, and a faint scent of perfume mixed with solvent inside a unit rented under a fake name. The unit held nothing valuable now, only an empty folding chair, a discarded plastic cup, and a strip of tape with a hair caught on it. The hair was long and dark. Elena's hair. There was also a small torn corner of paper wedged beneath the chair's leg, as if it had been stepped on and pressed into the concrete. The paper contained a partial letterhead, the kind used by offices that wanted to look official. The top showed an embossed seal shape, half visible. Marco recognized it immediately. It belonged to the office of Councilman Adrian Villaro, a man who smiled on television while his donors moved cash through shadows. Villaro was not supposed to be in Marco's world. He was supposed to be above it. But above was often just another angle of control. Marco had dealt with Villaro indirectly for years. Permits, inspections, building approvals, donations routed through charities. A handshake here, a favor there, boundaries carefully maintained to keep both sides clean enough to deny. Now Elena had traced letters suggesting Villaro, and the storage unit had carried Villaro's letterhead like a breadcrumb. Rafe argued for caution. A direct move against a councilman could trigger a law enforcement response with teeth. Marco listened, then decided caution was no longer the currency of survival. Elena's body had been used as a message. Marco would respond with a message that could not be deleted. But first, he needed to know why. Elena's next lucid moment came in the afternoon. Her gaze sharpened long enough for recognition. She watched Marco as if measuring the distance between the father she wanted and the man the city feared. Her hand moved again, slower than before, and traced more letters on the sheet. Marco forced himself to watch like a witness rather than a father. This time, the letters formed something clearer. Not a full name. A phrase, partial and fragmented, like a memory broken by drugs. It suggested a meeting. It suggested that the person Elena met was not the internship contact she had been told to expect. It suggested she had been lured with the promise of legal opportunity, then confronted with a demand. The demand was not money. It was leverage. Marco understood leverage the way sailors understood storms. It could be seen, smelled, predicted, and survived only with the right preparation. The missing security detail became the next piece. One of the two unanswered phones was traced to a warehouse district. Rafe's men found it smashed under a pile of scrap metal, the battery removed. Nearby, they found a smear of blood on the concrete and a scrap of fabric torn from a suit jacket. They followed the trail to a dockyard office where a man was bound and unconscious, left alive in a chair the way Elena had been left alive in an alley. His face was swollen. His wrists were cut. He was one of Elena's guards. When he came around, he could barely see through the swelling, but he managed to convey the essential truth. The detail had been rerouted by a call from someone using Marco's internal code phrases. The voice had sounded like Rafe's, or close enough. The guard had followed orders, moved Elena toward a side exit, and then everything became a blur of sudden pain and darkness. Someone had impersonated Rafe. Or someone had used Rafe's access. Marco's gaze shifted to the only place it could, inward. He ordered an audit of his own operation, a thing bosses rarely did because it implied vulnerability. Rafe accepted the order without insult, which told Marco something else. Rafe also felt the ground moving beneath them. By evening, Marco had enough to paint the outline of a plot. Someone with political reach had targeted Elena because she represented a boundary Marco could be forced to cross. Elena's law trajectory meant she might someday become inconvenient evidence or inconvenient morality. If someone could compromise her, ruin her, or threaten her, then Marco could be controlled. But the timing, the erasure of footage, and the stage delivery suggested more than extortion. It suggested a power play, a reshaping of alliances. Someone wanted Marco destabilized so a new arrangement could be installed. Marco's men traced financial movements connected to Vallaro's charity foundation. They found a shell company that owned the waterfront storage facility. They found invoices for security consultants that did not exist. They found a pattern of payments to a risk management firm that had ties to a rival group Marco had kept at bay, the Betrayal syndicate. Politics and foreign muscle. Clean smiles and dirty hands. Marco finally visited Elena alone in the clinic room after midnight. He stood by her bed and watched her chest rise with steadier strength. The drugs were leaving her system, but what remained would not be flushed so easily: the sense of being used. Marco placed a hand on the bed rail, not touching her, but close enough that she could see the intention. His presence was the only apology he knew how to offer. He swore to himself, silently and without ceremony, that whoever had touched Elena would learn what it meant to call him at 11 p.m. Then Rafe entered with information that fractured the remaining calm. A message had arrived at the Calderon Hotel, delivered by courier to the front desk like a gift. Inside the envelope was a single photograph printed on heavy paper. The photo showed Elena unconscious in the alley, taken from an angle Marco had not seen on the footage. Someone had been closer. Someone had waited long enough to take a clean shot. On the back of the photo was a date and a time written in neat ink, and beneath it a single location. Santoros, again. And beneath that, One more detail. A seat number in the private room. A demand for a meeting disguised as an invitation. Marco understood the real message without needing words. Whoever orchestrated this wanted him to come alone enough to be vulnerable, angry enough to be reckless, and desperate enough to accept terms. Marco looked at Elena, then at the photograph, then at Rafe. He did not speak. He simply nodded, and the city prepared for another midnight. The second night felt different, not because the city had changed, but because Marco Calderon had changed. The previous midnight had been shock. This one was intention shaped into steel. He did not go to Santoro's as a man walking into negotiation. He went as a man walking into a trap with his own trap folded inside his coat. He left the clinic only after ensuring Elena was stable and protected by layers of men who knew their loyalty would be measured in more than money. Marco dressed simply, no showy suit, no obvious weapon. He understood that the people who set this meeting would anticipate aggression. They would search for it. They would plan for it. So he hid it in patience instead. Rafe arranged the perimeter. Unmarked cars, men inside adjacent businesses, eyes on rooftops, eyes on side streets, eyes on every camera that still functioned. Tech specialists monitored cellular activity in the area to identify burner phones switching on and off in patterns. A second team waited near the waterfront storage facility in case Santoro's was a decoy and the real play was elsewhere. Lena remained under protection, but her part in the story was not over. She had become the accidental witness who could identify faces, scents, behaviors. She had seen the alley. She had heard the tone of fear in herself and survived it. Marco's world respected survivors, but it also used them. Santoro's looked unchanged from the outside. Its front entrance glowed, its valet attendants moved with polite urgency, and its patrons laughed as if no one had ever been harmed behind its walls. Marco entered through the rear corridor, escorted not by a crowd of muscle, but by the quiet certainty of men positioned out of sight. The private room was prepared like a stage. The table was set, the glassware flawless, the air clean. It smelled faintly of citrus and sanitizer, the kind of scent meant to suggest safety. Marco did not sit immediately. He walked the room with his eyes, cataloging exits, reflections, and angles. He noted the subtle absence of a camera lens that should have been present in a corner. He noted the way the chairs were positioned to force a certain line of sight. Then he sat, because sitting was the bait they wanted, and he wanted them to believe he had accepted their script. Minutes passed. The room remained silent. The restaurant's music remained distant, softened by walls and wealth. Marco's breathing stayed even. He had learned long ago that impatience was just fear in a hurry. When the door opened, the man who entered was not Councilman Villaro. It was a representative, a lawyer type with expensive shoes, calm posture, and eyes trained to remain neutral even when measuring death. Behind him came another man, broad and quiet, the kind of presence that carried violence without needing to display it. That second man was not local. His jawline and posture suggested a discipline shaped outside the city, perhaps with military edges. Marco understood the message. The councilman would not risk his own face yet. The representative placed an envelope on the table without ceremony. Inside were photocopies of documents. Photos of Elena leaving the clinic on a day months earlier, photos of Elena at a cafe, a partial file from her law school, and images that suggested surveillance had been running long before the alley. There were also printed screenshots of deleted Santoro's camera footage, recovered somehow, showing Elena in the private room with a man whose face was turned away. The representative's posture indicated he expected Marco to be shaken. Marco was not shaken. He was enraged with clarity. The representative conveyed the demand indirectly, as if even speaking in aloud might stain his suit. The demand revolved around territory. It revolved around construction contracts. It revolved around turning over a percentage of Marco's laundering corridors to a new partnership, the kind backed by politics and foreign syndicate muscle. In exchange, Elena's situation would be treated as an unfortunate incident rather than the beginning of a campaign. The threat was implied. If Marco refused, Elena would be targeted again, perhaps not with drugs next time, perhaps with something that could be broadcast and used to destroy her future publicly. Marco listened without shifting his expression, because shifting would give the representative something to report. Marco needed them to underestimate him. While the representative spoke, Rafe's men outside monitored the restaurant. They tracked two suspicious vehicles circling the block. They spotted a man near the rear exit pretending to smoke while scanning the alley. They detected a burst of cellular activity on a frequency consistent with coordination among a small team. The meeting was not just an exchange of demands. It was a live operation, poised to escalate. Marco's own operation moved in parallel. He had predicted that the attackers would want a second leverage point, something that could be activated if the negotiation failed. He assumed they had another location prepared, another body to drop, another camera angle to capture. So he had positioned his men at the waterfront storage facility, and at the clinic, and at two other sites connected to Elena's routine, widening the net to catch whatever secondary plan they were hiding. The catch came sooner than expected. A message flashed on Rafe's secure line: movement at the clinic. Two men in medical scrubs had attempted to access Elena's wing using an authorization code that did not belong to staff. They were stopped by Marco's guards, who noticed the wrong posture, the wrong tension, the wrong way their hands hovered near pockets. When confronted, the two men attempted to flee through a service stairwell. One was caught. One escaped into the night. The attempted breach proved something Marco needed to know. The Centaurus meeting was a distraction meant to draw Marco away from Elena again. They were repeating the tactic, hoping shock had softened him into predictable panic. But panic was not what Marco carried tonight. He carried calculation. Inside the private room, the representative continued, assuming Marco's silence meant contemplation. The broad foreign muscle behind him remained watchful, eyes flicking to the door. Marco remained still long enough for his men outside to receive the update, adjust positions, and close in on the suspicious vehicles circling Centaurus. Two men were intercepted near the rear exit. One had a concealed weapon. One had a small device consistent with a signal jammer. That confirmed another layer. They'd planned to cut communication at a crucial moment, isolating Marco, forcing him to respond inside a sealed box. Marco chose the moment to change the script. He rose from his chair slowly, not like a man about to fight, but like a man about to leave. The representative's posture shifted, uncertain. Marco did not touch the envelope. He did not touch the documents. He moved as if none of it mattered, because in truth none of it did compared to the only thing he wanted, the identity of the person who ordered the drugging. The broad man stepped slightly, a subtle block, suggesting exit would not be granted without terms. The representative's eyes hardened, more calculation visible now. Marco's phone vibrated once in his pocket. Rafe signaled that the perimeter was closing and the clinic was secure. The attempted breach had failed. The captured imposter was alive and being questioned. Marco stepped toward the door anyway. The broad man's hand moved toward his jacket, a slow reach that was not yet a draw, but close enough to declare intent. In that fraction of time, Marco realized the true purpose of this meeting. It was not negotiation. It was not leverage. It was a demonstration, a councilman and a syndicate proving they could corner Marco in a room, control exits, erase footage, and dictate the tempo of his life. Marco refused to be taught. Outside the room, Rafe's men cut the power to Santoro's rear corridor lighting for 3 seconds, a planned blink that allowed them to reposition unseen. When the lights returned, the exit path was no longer under the attacker's control. Marco walked out. He did not run. He did not rush. He moved with the calm of a man who owned the air. Behind him, the representative's plan cracked. The broad muscle shifted, uncertain whether to escalate in a restaurant full of wealthy witnesses. Marco reached the rear hallway where Rafe waited, expression tight. Marco read the urgency immediately. The captured imposter from the clinic had been searched. Inside his pocket was a folded note, written in the same neat ink as the photograph's back. It contained a single name and a single instruction. The name was not Villaro. The name was one Marco had trusted for years. And the instruction was not about territory. It was about Elena. It implied that Elena's survival was optional now, that her role as leverage was evolving into a role as warning. Marco's world narrowed to a single point of heat. Betrayal inside the organization was the only way the impersonation of Rafe's codes and access could have happened. Someone close had fed the attacker's timing, routes, and protocol. The name on the note belonged to a man who had eaten at Marco's table, who had kissed rings, who had sworn loyalty. Marco's logistics captain, the man who controlled transport routes and safe transfers. If that man had flipped, then Marco's entire system had a poison vein running through it. Marco left Santoros without spectacle. Outside, the night remained wet and cold. But now it carried certainty. The enemy was not only outside the walls. The enemy had been walking inside them. And Elena, asleep behind guarded doors, remained the reason the next move would be unforgiving. The logistics captain's name was Dante Morelli, a man who understood the city like a map folded in his skull. He knew which trucks went where, which warehouses held cash, which port docks were clean, which roads were watched. If Dante had betrayed Marco, then he had not simply leaked information. He had opened doors that were never meant to be visible. Marco did not confront Dante immediately. Confrontation invited denial, and denial invited delays. Marco chose a different strategy. He allowed Dante to believe his betrayal remained hidden while he built a cage around him. Rafe's team tracked Dante's movements through the night. Dante left his usual office at a reasonable hour and drove not to his home, but to a property on the edge of the industrial zone, a place registered under a shell company tied to the same charity foundation associated with Councilman Villaro. Dante entered with confidence, not nervous, which suggested he believed his new allies controlled the streets. Marco waited until dawn, not out of patience, but out of discipline. He used the hours to secure Elena's safety beyond the clinic. He moved her to a different location, a safe house disguised as a rehabilitation residence, staffed by people who owed Marco loyalty that could not be purchased by outsiders. He rotated guards, changed codes, and severed lines of communication that had been compromised. He ensured no single person, not even Rafe, held complete access to Elena's whereabouts. Betrayal thrived on certainty. Marco would starve it. Then he visited the captured imposter from the clinic. The man was bruised, sweating, and trembling under the pressure of survival. Marco did not need to strike him. Marco needed him to understand that lying would prolong suffering, while truth might shorten it. The man's body language eventually surrendered. The imposter revealed that his team had been hired through a third party, paid in cash, and instructed to wear scrubs to slip through clinic security. They had been given an access code and a schedule. They had been told Elena would be left with minimal guards because Marco would be at Santoros. The plan had been to finish what the drug started, not by violence, but by suffocation disguised as medical complication, something that could be blamed on overdose or shock. The plan had been halted only because Marco had anticipated a second strike. Marco extracted the final detail that mattered. The third party who hired them had met them at the waterfront storage facility, the same unit where Elena's hair had been found. That coordinator wore a suit, spoke softly, and carried an air of authority. He had shown them a seal on letterhead to convince them the job was protected by officials. Politics, again. But the coordinator's description included a distinctive feature: a scar near the ear, hidden under hair, a mark that matched an old injury Marco remembered from years ago. It was the scar of a man named Luca Serrano, a former intelligence contractor who now worked privately for whoever could afford secrecy. Luca had been seen in Vallaro's circles, advising on security risks, which in Marco's world meant arranging violence without fingerprints. The web tightened: Vallaro's office, Serrano's coordination, Petrov's muscle, and Dante Morelli's betrayal as the internal key. Marco prepared the ending the same way he prepared every major move, not as an explosion, but as a controlled collapse of the enemy's structure. He arranged a false shipment, a bait convoy rumored to carry cash and sensitive ledgers. The rumor was planted through channels only Dante controlled. If Dante passed it along, Marco would know. If the rumor reached Vallaro's sphere, Marco would have confirmation of the pipeline. The rumor reached them before noon. By evening, surveillance confirmed movement. Petrov linked vehicles positioned near the supposed route. Serrano's presence detected via burner phone pinging near the industrial property Dante had visited. Dante himself moved again, not to his office but to the waterfront, arriving at the storage facility as if returning to a place where his new allegiance had been sealed. Marco did not strike in public. He struck in silence. Racemen closed the waterfront perimeter in unmarked cars, blocking exits without drawing attention. Marco arrived last, stepping into the storage facility corridor with the calm of a man walking into his own basement. The air smelled of saltwater and concrete dust. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, making shadows feel restless. Inside the unit, Dante stood near a folding table, phone in hand, posture casual. Across from him stood Luca Serrano, immaculate and calm, the scar faint under the harsh light. Behind Serrano waited two men with the disciplined posture of Petrov's soldiers. Marco entered without announcing himself. For a fraction of a second, Dante's face revealed shock so pure it could not be hidden. That shock confirmed everything. Serrano's expression shifted into professional composure. He had expected Marco to be angry, desperate, cornered. He had not expected Marco to appear like a verdict. Marco did not speak. He did not need to. His presence answered every question about who controlled the city's shadows. Racemen stepped in behind Marco, sealing the unit. The Petrov soldiers reached toward their jackets, then stopped, reading the numbers, understanding that this was not a room they could shoot their way out of without starting a war that would burn everyone. Marco approached Dante first, not with violence, but with a stillness that made violence unnecessary. Dante's betrayal had not been emotional. It had been transactional. He had sold access because he believed Marco's power was fading, because he believed politics and foreign muscle could replace old-world loyalty. Marco's gaze held Dante long enough to strip excuses away. He wanted Dante to understand the cost of calculating incorrectly. Then Marco turned to Serrano, because Serrano represented the kind of enemy Marco hated most, the one who believed himself untouchable because he worked behind seals and letterheads. Marco's plan unfolded without noise. He had already gathered evidence from Santoro's residue, storage unit debris, the imposter's confession, and surveillance. He had compiled it into a package designed not for the police, but for the federal task force that only moved when politics wanted to destroy politics. Marco knew which agent hated Vallaro, which prosecutor wanted a headline, which internal rival wanted Vallaro's seat. He had built a secondary weapon, exposure. Serrano could not intimidate exposure. Petrov could not shoot exposure. Vallaro could not delete exposure if it was already in the hands of people who benefited from keeping it alive. Marco did not need to kill Serrano in that unit. Killing Serrano would make Serrano a mystery. Letting Serrano live long enough to be arrested would make Serrano a chain, and Marco intended to wrap that chain around Vallaro's throat. The true punishment for Marco was not immediate blood. It was controlling outcomes. Dante's punishment would be internal, swift, and final. Not for revenge, but for hygiene. Betrayal was infection. Infection spread unless cut out. Marco left the waterfront with the city still gray and damp, but now the rhythm had returned to something he recognized, fear shifting away from him and toward the people who had made the mistake of touching Elena. By nightfall, Councilman Vallaro's office was raided by federal agents on a financial corruption warrant that concealed darker investigations beneath it. News outlets reported only the clean version: misuse of funds, shell companies, illegal contracts. The deeper truth stayed hidden in sealed affidavits and whispered courtrooms. Serrano disappeared into custody under a name the public never learned. Petrov's local presence retreated, sensing that politics had become radioactive. Elena recovered slowly. Her memory returned in fragments: a room, a wrong face, a sweet taste in a drink, hands guiding her toward a side exit, then darkness. The shame and anger came afterward, heavier than the bruises. She woke one morning in the safe house and stared out a window at a city that looked ordinary, as if it had not tried to swallow her. Marco visited her without entourage. He stood at a distance and watched her breathe, watched her shoulders lift and fall, watched the quiet rage behind her eyes. He understood that saving her body did not save her trust. That would take time, and time was the one thing Marco had never truly believed in, because time was what took everything eventually. He did not offer speeches. Speeches were for politicians. He offered what he could: control returned to her life, safety rebuilt around her, and the knowledge that the people who used her as leverage had been dismantled not only with violence, but with the destruction of their illusion of immunity. Elena did not forgive him. Not yet. Forgiveness was not a switch. It was a slow surrender of pain. But she remained alive. She remained breathing. She remained unbroken enough to choose what came next. And somewhere deep in the city, men who once believed Marco Calderon could be cornered learned a lesson carved into the quietest part of the night. Calling at 11 p.m. did not summon a negotiation. It summoned a reckoning.